Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some discussion of my litrpg web serial science fantasy story, Archangels of Phobos. Today, we're going to be talking about the reason behind the Amy and David chapters. These might seem like they're a bit out of left field. They're definitely getting fewer views than the mainline chapters. And I want to go through the reason that these exist and also why they're so important to the future of where the story is going. I have not yet decided where I want them to be in the mainline chapters. So they're definitely going to be in the first book worth of story, but I don't know exactly where. Currently, I'm leaning towards having the Interludes 1 and 2 be after Chapter 9, Interludes 3 and 4 be after Chapter 12, and Interludes 5 and 6 be after the yet-to-be-released Chapter 25, which is the furthest I've written in the mainline chapters at the moment, although it's worth saying that it is pretty rough at the moment. Everything 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, everything in that section needs a lot more work. The purpose of these chapters is to introduce some themes that Elishia, being quite naive, doesn't think of. Actually, Elishia does sort of mention them a little bit. I've peppered them through a little bit into her introspection, but they're not centered in her storyline at all. And that is, imagine that you're on Earth and a very small number of people develop superpowers. Suddenly, every national military wants you. But they're not going to ask you, oh, please come and fight for us. Please come and train our troops. They're going to be setting traps to find you, to catch you, to experiment on you, all sorts of things like that. And that's going to be the case whether we're talking about the dictatorial countries or the democratic countries. They're both going to do exactly the same thing. Now, when I was editing this, I realized that there's another film that comes to mind that has some of this sort of theme going on in it. Here I'm thinking about the 1996 action film Chain Reaction, which had Keanu Reeves in it, amongst other people. And it's just one of those fun action flicks, not that much of a story, but the story that is there is a scientist discovers a way to generate power essentially for free, and suddenly every single nation in the world wants to control him. They want to be able to have sole control over this new power, and that's the central theme. The way it plays out, you can watch the film or you can read a summary of it somewhere on Wikipedia or whatever if you're interested. But that's a core dynamic to that film. It's a core theme of it. I wanted to see that here, but I wanted to be a slow realization amongst characters that this is going to be a danger that's coming up for them. This is definitely going to be even more the case in a context where just some of the geopolitical tensions that exist on Earth today, they've been able to simmer and get worse for several years at this point. The story is set in a moderately grim but not absolutely horrible future as far as geopolitical tensions go. So all the geopolitical tensions you saw in 2025, many of which got worse in 26, those are going to be worse again in 33. One of the other things I wanted to explore though is what it's like to be in a situation where you've only ever known the normal world and suddenly you're thrust into the supernatural, but you're also thrust into it in an environment that you don't really control. Now, the original version of this story arc had these two characters be even more different in power than they are. You may have noticed if you've read all of these interlude chapters that Amy is considerably more powerful than David. Originally, David was just going to be an ordinary person. But then when I was trying to write fight scenes around that, I just couldn't make them work. So then at that point, I decided I was going to have David become more powerful than that, but not anywhere near as powerful as Amy. There's a couple of particular reasons for this power discrepancy in universe that are not yet revealed to the reader. So we'll come back to those later. Now, the original incarnation of Chapter 2 was reasonably similar to what you saw, at least once I decided that it wasn't going to work with David having no powers at all. When I was trying to make it work without that, I obviously didn't have the Allosaurus near the end, but the rest of it was all very similar. But one of the key things I wanted to do was test their own dynamics with each other, as it turned out that Amy was becoming more and more powerful. And one of the themes that I think comes up a lot with them interpersonally, or at least it's meant to, whether this comes through or not is not entirely clear to me as yet. It feels like it does when I read my own stuff, but I'm not sure that I've actually nailed that. One of the things that I was trying to get across here is that David's constantly feeling inadequate when actually he's not. He just believes he's inadequate. And that's something he'll have to eventually come to terms with. I also wanted to establish some of the things related to world building in the story. So one of the key things is this concept of folded realms, which are very similar to a mystic realm in other lit RPG stories, except for one important thing, and that is that they can also be a power source for magic. Now, the characters know absolutely none of this. And one of the things I decided early on was that I was going to have a situation where characters find out different amounts about the reality of how the world works independently from each other, and you as the reader would only see true information, or at least when you get information that's wrong because a character is wrong about it and is in first person, at least they would be clear they weren't sure about it. So I wanted to have this situation where the reader knows more about what's going on with the world, what's going on with the power systems than any individual character does. At the same time, no one really knows everything yet in world. Elishia and Natalia know more than anyone else, and that's because they've had some sort of external source of information. So Elishia, by the point of these chapters, she is probably about to meet Shimon, and Natalia has had some interactions with a mysterious voice in chapter 3, one that I haven't explained yet, but that is very important. Anyways, being a lit RPG story, this definitely needed to have some combat scenes in it. I also wanted to have something be quite different between Amy and David on the one hand and Elishia on the other. Elishia is an explorer, and so she's more inclined to go into the mysterious portals of her own account. Whereas Amy and David, they definitely have not done that as yet. They're more looking for a way back. They realized, oh, this is a really bad situation. We've got to get back to civilization, find out what's happening. While they're doing that, they end up getting caught into this essentially trap, you could call it. It's not laid for them with intent. Instead, it's something where there's just a magical surge of power that has captured them. And they wind up in this small folded realm that feels like the inside of a cathedral, and it has a number of weird, half undead, half automaton monsters in it, which they then battle, and ultimately you get a sense again that Amy is much more powerful than David. At least that's the way it's intended to play out. She drops her massive fireball nuke, and I had a lot of fun writing that and really exaggerating the effects on it, because I wanted this to not be your sort of standard fireballs from RPGs and the like, where it's just an instantaneous explosion. I wanted it to be something that's just a bit more in depth than that, and something that is not a routine attack. This is something that feels a bit more special when it's used. And I'll mention here as an inspiration, one of the games I used to play, it's kind of gone really far down the pay-to-win / pay-to-cheat path now, but I used to really love Dungeons & Dragons Online. And whilst it has instantaneous fireballs, there's something that just feels really impressive about that spell when you get it. It's so much bigger, so much better than any of your lower tier spells, that it's just really visually striking when it goes off. Now that's by 2007 standards, so you got to keep in mind that that's when I started playing that game. That's when I started getting hooked on it. And that era of graphics was not what it is now. But there was just this feel that you were casting something a bit more special. One of the things I really liked in the earlier incarnations of Path of Exile 2 was the first version of Fireball that they had. Back when it was a rank 9 skill, back when it was something that didn't just fire off one bolt of fire, it then exploded on its own without any further interactions from other mechanics. That was something I felt was really satisfying in Path of Exile 2 as well. So, fireballs that are visceral, powerful, and do something cool, these are something I really like. Anything that I feel becomes a bit cliched in terms of skills is something that I'll definitely work on. If I want to integrate that core concept, I'll definitely change it. You'll also see this when we talk about fire lances in the mainline chapters, so I don't feel like this is any significant plot spoiler. There's weapons that are utilized in chapters 13 and 14 from memory, as well as a little bit later, but whilst they are something that conjures a burst of fire, so in that sense you could think of them as being like a once-a-day wand of fireball from Pathfinder, instead it's actually something quite a bit different, because the fireball that it conjures sticks to the foe, and you'll see how that gets used in one of the chapters there. After that, we have the flight scene. So I think there's a lot of different ways that people approach writing in general. And my approach is that I have a number of what I would term milestone cinematic events in my mind, and those are absolutely burnt into my mind. I know the core directions that the story is going to go, but what I do not know is every step along the way. And so one of the first parts that I had in this entire sequence was this flight. However, the part that came just before it, with the fight scene inside the cathedral, that was something that was one of the last parts of this that was written. So the core thing that I wanted to go for here was a situation where they couldn't fly all of the way back to the car for some reason, and that was originally going to be due to mana starvation, but then the more that I thought about it, the more I realized, no, I wanted it to be a bit of a decision that tells you something about the characters instead. by having a situation where there are bystanders that will be risky for them to try to save. And ultimately, that's exactly what happened with the family that they meet on top of Mount Howard. Now, fun little fact about this is that while I was writing this, while I was originally drafting this, I got a ping on WhatsApp from a friend, and I'm having a look at it. It sort of distracts me a little bit while I'm writing. And then I'm like, right, you know what? I'm going to write not just you, but your entire family into this scene. And so I mentally aged up this friend to account for the fact that this story is taking place in 2033, whereas I was writing this, actually I was writing this part in 2024 from memory. And at that point it was actually set in 2032, but not much difference. And so I'm like, okay, what are you and your partner likely to look like in 8 or 10 years? What's your kid going to look like in 8 or 10 years? And I decided to just basically insert them. Worth noting, of course, that I do change names when I do this, but also this is not the only time that I've done this, and a lot of characters have significant personality traits or significant appearance traits that are pulled from people that I do know IRL. So if you're someone who does know me IRL and you see some remnants of yourself in one of the characters, maybe it actually is. So that was something that if I'd been putting this together a day earlier or a day later, probably would have had someone different there. But I wanted to have that in there so that there was just this sense of, all right, now we've got to get out of this space. And then we had this final scene that was one of the sort of first inspirations that I had, which is the Phoenix flying and leading a convoy of cars out of this area. Now, during this period, Amy and David have been talking a little bit to each other about what things are going to be like when they get back to Melbourne. And they're expecting that everything that's happened to them on Mount Speculation has been widespread. They're wrong in that, and that's because they don't understand exactly why that stuff happened at Mount Speculation. At this point, I don't think the reader knows either. I think the reader might have a couple of inklings as to what might be going on. They will have worked out the exact trigger conditions as to why it was that there was some sort of magical event there, but the severity of it, the fact that it was so much more powerful than anything else, that's definitely not known to any character, nor is it known to the reader. And so at this point, you're thinking, all right, well, what on earth is going to be the case when they get back to Melbourne? And of course, the answer is normality. But at this point, I wanted to introduce Amy's mother as a character who is much more cynical. And this was intended to really set the tone for where things are going to go later. This conversation is going to have quite an impact on Amy and David, but probably not quite enough. And it's also going to foreshadow a lot of what's going to go on from here. Because like I mentioned earlier, one of the key themes I was going for was looking at just how moderate level superpowers would end up being something that every existing structure in society would seek to exploit. And that's going to end up being the centerpiece of what's going to happen to Amy and David over the next few months. So I want to finish by talking about my plans for these characters going forward, but I also want to be a little bit cryptic here in order to avoid spoilers. So they are definitely going to make it into the climax of book 1, and it is my present plan that they're going to play an ongoing role after that. However, I do not give my characters plot armor. They're going to make their own decisions, and if those decisions mean that one or both of them are not able to survive that climax, then that's just going to be what happens. And I'll have to figure out new characters to develop in their place. I've worked out most of their pathway there, and in fact, I've written it, but Interludes 7, 8, and 9 really need some serious revision. They're all actually very short, and they're from a point of view you're probably not expecting at the moment, but they need quite a lot of work in order to get to a release-worthy state. Additionally, I don't want them to come out for a while, because Amy and David are going to take a back seat in terms of driving the story for a little while. What's going to happen is they're going to be much more reactive, someone else is going to be proactive, and that's going to be where they come back into the story again. But that's going to be a couple of months away, because I've worked out that the climax of book 1 is likely to take place at some point in March of 2034, and as a result, I'm just working on the timeline of exactly other events that are going on at the point, how all of the different timelines intersect, how all of the different character paths intersect. And of course, I have to review the Claire and Tash interlude, which is the one that I think is the most fun that I've written so far, and also the Ryan and Zyra interludes, which is something that's quite a bit different. I will say that writing Ryan has been a real challenge because I want him to be sympathetic, but at the same time, I also don't have very much in common at all with this guy. This character that I'm writing here is a very, very different person to me, very different lived experience, very different attitudes on pretty much everything, very different values. And so writing him has been a real challenge. That's something I'm still working on, but partly I've got a little bit of leniency there because I've already got the Ryan and Zara chapters written. They will need to be revised, but they're set several weeks ahead of the events that we've seen so far. So they're set in late January of 2034, and whilst they might not release in exactly chronological order, I'll release in something reasonably close to it. But they're going to have a shorter story than Amy and David get, and Claire and Tash get shorter again, but they're all going to converge at some point in the future. I'm going to leave it there though, let you find out what happens to these characters yourself as I finish writing it. May your folded realms contain interesting loot.